Everything you know about the CIA is wrong. Not because they lied to you, because the truth is stranger than anything they could have invented. Today, we open 13 declassified files that Washington kept sealed for decades. We'll walk into the basement of a foreign psychiatric hospital, where American doctors were running experiments that would be illegal in a war zone. We'll follow a ghost ship carrying a dead man who never existed. And finally, a program so vast, so deeply buried, that when the documents were shredded, they burned the building they were stored in. The paper, the walls, everything. Ready? We're starting. 13. They called it Operation Gold. But the locals in Cold War Berlin had another name for it. They called it the tunnel that knew too much. In 1954, a construction crew began digging beneath a bombed-out warehouse on the American side of the divided city. The warehouse sat on Rudow Street in West Berlin, unremarkable, the kind of building that ghosts live in. Inside, American and British intelligence officers were doing something that had never been attempted on this scale. They were digging a tunnel 300 feet long, pointed directly under the Soviet sector of the city, aimed at 3 buried Soviet telephone cables carrying military communications. The dig took 11 months. Engineers constructed a climate-controlled chamber to keep the cables from showing temperature shifts from below. They built a listening room equipped with 317 tape recorders, running 24 hours a day. The tunnel walls were reinforced with steel plating. By 1955, it was operational. For almost a year, analysts in that underground room processed 443,000 hours of recorded conversation. But the strangest part is not what the tunnel captured. We'll come back to that. The intelligence was enormous. Soviet order of battle documents, supply chains, troop rotations across East Germany, the kind of material that agencies dream about for careers. Then, in April 1956, Soviet forces suddenly appeared at the tunnel's entrance from the other side. They dug down, opened it, and announced to the world that they had discovered an American spy operation. Cameras, press coverage, international humiliation. Here is what the declassified files confirmed. The Soviets had known about the tunnel before the first shovel hit the dirt. A British intelligence officer named George Blake had attended every planning meeting, and Blake was feeding information directly to Moscow. The tunnel was never secret on the Soviet side. They let it run for 11 months because exposing it immediately would have revealed that Blake existed. Your tax dollars, 3 million of them, built the most expensive recording studio in history for an audience that was already listening. The intelligence community uses a phrase for this. They call it a notional asset, something real that functions as something fake without anyone in the room knowing. Operation Gold was real. The intelligence was real. The secrecy was a performance. This isn't a spy story. It's a funhouse mirror with a locked door on both sides. 12. Some operations never leave the ground. Operation Acoustic Kitty never left the veterinary table. In the early 1960s, inside the Directorate of Science and Technology, on the campus of the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a team of behavioral scientists and surgeons proposed something that sounds like science fiction when you read the declassified summary. They proposed turning a domestic cat into a mobile eavesdropping device. The cat was a tabby. The documents don't give it a name. Surgeons implanted a small microphone inside its ear canal. A thin antenna wire ran under its fur, along the length of its spine, and out through its tail. A small transmitter was placed beneath the skin at the base of its neck. The battery was housed in its chest cavity. The surgeries took about an hour, but the strangest problem was not the surgery. We'll come back to that. The total program cost was estimated at approximately $20 million across its full development run. Adjusted for today, that sits somewhere north of $150 million for a cat. The cat completed its initial tests. Engineers confirmed the transmitter was working. The microphone was picking up ambient sound. In 1966, the animal was delivered to a park near the Soviet embassy in Washington, released near a bench where 2 Soviet intelligence officers were known to have conversations. And now, the strangest problem. You cannot tell a cat where to go. The moment it was released, the animal, hungry, disoriented by surgery, indifferent to the geopolitical context, walked directly toward a nearby food vendor. Before it reached the bench, it was struck by a taxi. The CIA's internal review concluded that the program, quote, would not lend itself to our highly disciplined, specialized needs. This sentence, written by a man in a suit behind a mahogany desk in Virginia, may be the single greatest understatement in the history of American intelligence. They spent $20 million discovering that cats do not take orders. The implants were real, the surgeries were real, the cat was real, the taxi was real, and somewhere in the basement of the National Archives, the full technical specifications for how to install surveillance equipment into a living animal are still stored in a manila envelope with a blue classification stripe that has now been peeled back. Some ideas survived their own failure. This one got a patent. 11. Before the internet, before satellites, before fiber optic cables crossed the ocean floor, there was a simpler time when the only way to listen to a foreign government was to be in the room. Operation Invisible Ink was the CIA's attempt to be in the room, specifically a room in the Egyptian embassy in Washington. In 1977, a team of CIA technical officers developed a method for reading encrypted diplomatic cables without physically stealing them. The technology used a concept called Van Eck freaking, the detection of electromagnetic emissions produced by electronic equipment. Every cathode ray screen, every electric typewriter, every cipher machine. Each device broadcasts a faint electromagnetic signal as it operates. That signal, if you are close enough with the right receiver, reconstructs what is on the screen. The team set up listening equipment in a building across the street. From there, analysts could reconstruct the content of cipher messages being typed inside the embassy in real time. Here is what made this operation unusual. It was entirely passive. No agent inside the building. No physical break-in, no stolen documents. The embassy staff could sweep their own rooms for bugs every single day and find nothing, because there was nothing to find. The electromagnetic footprint of their own machines was the bug. The program ran for 2 years before a technical countermeasure, shielded copper lining inside the embassy walls, degraded the signal enough to end it. When the Egyptians eventually discovered what had happened, they complained through diplomatic channels. The State Department issued no confirmation and no denial. This is called a non-response. In diplomatic language, a non-response is a confession. What you type in a room you believe is sealed, isn't. It never was. The air itself carries what you meant to keep private. 10. They gave it a name that sounds like a postal service, Operation Mockingbird. And in a sense, that is exactly what it was. Beginning in the early 1950s and continuing, according to the Church Committee investigation of 1975, well into the following decade, the CIA maintained a covert network of relationships with American journalists, editors, and news executives. The Church Committee, a Senate Select Committee investigating intelligence abuses, identified over 400 American journalists who had secretly carried out CIA assignments. Not informants, not tipsters. Journalists who were actively working within their publications as intelligence operatives. The confirmed relationships included figures at major American newspapers and wire services, personnel at 2 of the 3 major television networks, and editors at national magazines. Specific names remain partially redacted in the public record, but the Church Committee confirmed the mechanism. Stories were planted, stories were killed, angles were shaped. What appeared in the morning paper had sometimes been reviewed the night before by someone who did not work in a newsroom. The justification was containment. The Cold War required information management. The enemy had propaganda. The United States needed counter-narrative. But here is what the declassified testimony made clear. The network was not used exclusively for foreign audiences. Domestic readers, American citizens, were consuming news that had been curated by an intelligence agency they were never told was involved. Somewhere in your family's history is a newspaper from the 1960s. Your grandfather read it over breakfast. He believed it. It was written by a man who had 2 employers and told him about only one. The Mockingbird does not sing its own song. It sings yours. Back to you. 9. There is a small island off the coast of Cuba. On most maps from the 1960s, it appears as an unremarkable piece of land. But inside the CIA's Technical Services Division, that island had a different name. They called it the Laboratory. Operation Mongoose was the official name of the Kennedy administration's program to destabilize the Cuban government. But the technical annex of Mongoose, the portion that remained classified the longest, detailed activities that went far beyond political operations. The Technical Services Division, working from a facility in Washington, developed and tested a series of devices intended to affect the physical and psychological state of foreign leaders without leaving traceable evidence. Among the confirmed contents of the declassified files, a diving suit treated with a fungal spore that would cause a debilitating skin disease, intended as a gift for Cuban lawyers who would pass it to a specific target. A contaminated cigar, a device described in the files only as a biological aerosol projector, with specific dimensions noted in centimeters, but its contents redacted. And then there is the item that the Church Committee investigators could not classify under any existing category. They called it the Shellfish Toxin Dart Gun, a custom-built pneumatic device the size of a .45 caliber pistol, firing a dart the width of a human hair, delivering a compound that caused cardiac arrest and dissolved upon entry, leaving no detectable trace in an autopsy. The device was demonstrated before the committee in open session. The committee chairman held it up. The cameras photographed it. The photograph is in the public record. The device was confirmed to have been tested. Whether it was ever deployed remains, officially, unknown. A dart the width of a hair. A heart that stops. A report that says natural causes. What would you call that? 8. The most expensive single intelligence failure in American history did not involve a mole, a defection, or a satellite. It involved a tugboat pulling a stolen Soviet submarine through the Pacific Ocean. They called it Project Azorian. The cover story was a deep-sea mining operation run by a billionaire with a reputation for eccentricity. A custom-built ship named the Hughes Glomar Explorer, 618 feet of steel, registered to Howard Hughes' Summa Corporation, deployed to a location in the North Pacific, 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii. Below it, in nearly 3 miles of water, lay the wreck of a Soviet Golf-class ballistic missile submarine, designated K-129, which had sunk in 1968 with a crew of 98 men. The CIA wanted the submarine, specifically its nuclear warheads, its code books, and its communications encryption equipment. Engineers designed a device called Clementine, a giant mechanical claw with 8 arms, lowered on a pipe string 18,000 feet to the ocean floor. The engineering required to build it was genuinely unprecedented. The claws had to operate at pressures that crush standard steel housings like tin cans. In the summer of 1974, Clementine reached the hull. It gripped, and it broke. The forward section of the submarine, containing the most valuable materials, fell back to the ocean floor during the lift. What was recovered contained 6 bodies of Soviet sailors. They were given a burial at sea with full military honors, filmed by the CIA, with a ceremony conducted in both English and Russian. That footage was released to the Russian government by the CIA in 1992. The operation cost approximately $800 million in 1974 dollars. It recovered partial materials, 3 missiles with their warheads missing, and 6 bodies. The codebooks were not among them. The world's most expensive salvage operation. The world's most expensive partial success. And somewhere at the bottom of the North Pacific, in water colder than ice and darker than anything you have ever seen, there is still a submarine, exactly where it was, waiting. 7. When you think of Cold War psychological operations, you think of leaflets dropped from aircraft, radio broadcasts, translated pamphlets. You do not think of modern art. But that is exactly what the CIA funded. Beginning in the early 1950s and confirmed through documents declassified in the 1990s, the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, a front organization with offices in 35 countries, covertly financed some of the most celebrated art of the post-war era. Abstract Expressionism, the movement that transformed American painting, the movement that made New York the center of the art world instead of Paris. Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning. Their work was promoted, exhibited, and toured internationally by organizations the artists themselves believed were independent cultural bodies. The funding path was layered through foundations and private donors, each layer adding distance from Langley. The strategic logic was elegant. Abstract Expressionism represented individual freedom, uncontrolled creative energy, the rejection of the rigid figurative propaganda of Soviet socialist realism. Every show of an American abstract canvas in Paris or Milan or London was a visual argument. Look what free people create. Look what their art looks like. Compare it to the other kind. The artists never knew. De Kooning never knew that the exhibition of his work in Italy was underwritten by the same organization that was also bribing Italian politicians. Pollock never knew that the drip paintings hanging in Rome had been selected, shipped, and insured by an intelligence operation. You have stood in a museum. You looked at a canvas. What you felt was real. What funded it was something else entirely. Art is a weapon. Someone just forgot to tell the artist. 6. There is a building in Guatemala City that does not look special. Low concrete walls, a courtyard with a dry fountain. But between 1960 and 1965, that building was the site of a program that the CIA's own Internal Review Board later described as the most ethically complex operation in the division's history. They called it Operation PBHISTORY's Interrogation Annex. The official file was sealed until 2003. The CIA was supporting the Guatemalan government's counterinsurgency program. As part of that support, American advisors attached to the program developed and distributed a training manual. The manual was titled KUBARK, Counterintelligence Interrogation. It was printed in 1963. The declassified version runs 128 pages. The KUBARK manual describes interrogation techniques in the precise, bureaucratic language of a government training document. Sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, temperature manipulation, positional stress. The manual notes, with clinical detachment, that regression, a psychological state in which a subject becomes dependent and childlike, is the desired outcome. It describes how to achieve it systematically. These techniques were not hypothetical. The manual was used. Copies were distributed to Allied intelligence services in at least 6 Latin American countries. In 1997, a Senate investigation confirmed that graduates of programs using Kubark-derived training had been responsible for human rights abuses in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala throughout the 1980s. The manual exists. It is in the public record. You can read it today. 128 pages of precise instructions, written by American government employees in 1963, which describe, in the language of behavioral science, how to dismantle a person from the inside. The most dangerous documents are not the ones that are encrypted. They are the ones that explain exactly what they are doing in plain English. 5. This one starts with a letter mailed from a dead man. Operation Northwoods is among the most cited of all declassified intelligence documents, but the version most people reference is the sanitized summary. The full Joint Chiefs of Staff Memorandum, signed on March 13, 1962, and declassified in 1997, contains proposals that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs sent directly to the Secretary of Defense with a recommendation for approval. The document proposes, and this is verbatim from the public record, a series of pretexts to justify military intervention in Cuba. Among the specific proposals, the sinking of an American vessel in Guantanamo Bay with casualties, attributed to Cuba. Bombings in Miami, Florida, and Washington, attributed to Cuban agents. The development of a program to, quote, develop the international image of the Cuban government as reckless and incompetent. But the proposal that investigators in 1997 stopped on longest is the one involving aircraft. The memorandum proposes the use of a civilian charter aircraft, with passenger manifests of real American college students on a spring break trip that never actually departs. Because an identical aircraft, painted and numbered the same, would take off from a different location and be destroyed over Cuba, producing wreckage and a passenger list of people who never boarded it. The dead would be real names. The aircraft would be a ghost. President Kennedy rejected the proposal. The rejection is documented. Northwoods was never implemented. But the fact that a signed memorandum from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommending an operation of this nature reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense, that fact does not go away because it was rejected. The plan was real. The signatures were real. The only thing that was not real was the aircraft. And they had already figured out how to build one. 4. It is 1953. A British intelligence officer and a CIA officer sit across from each other in a basement office in London. they have a problem. The democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran is nationalizing the oil industry. He wants to take British Petroleum's assets, and they have a solution. They called it Operation Ajax on the American side, and Operation Boot on the British side. The combined operation ran through the summer of 1953 and resulted in the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and the restoration of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to full autocratic power. The mechanics were confirmed in a CIA internal history declassified in 2013. The operation involved bribing Iranian newspaper editors to print fabricated stories portraying Mossadegh as a communist. It involved hiring gangs to carry out street violence and attribute it to Mossadegh supporters. It involved paying Iranian military officers to switch their loyalties. The budget was approximately $1 million in 1953 dollars, roughly $11 million today. On August 19, 1953, Mossadegh was arrested. He was tried for treason and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah ruled Iran until 1979. His secret police, trained and equipped by American and Israeli intelligence, are documented to have used methods derived directly from Cuba. The revolution that overthrew him in 1979 brought to power a government that has defined American foreign policy challenges for more than 40 years. $1 million, one elected government, 40 years of consequences. Every domino that fell in the Middle East from 1979 onward, the hostage crisis, the proxy wars, the nuclear standoff, has a thread that runs back to that basement in London in 1953. The oil was recovered. Everything else was a cost that no one put in the budget. 3. Before we reach the final two entries, let's be clear about what we are standing in front of. Every operation before this one was about manipulation, about information, about leverage. What comes next crossed a different kind of line. A line that, once crossed, the agency itself eventually acknowledged should never have been crossed. Take a breath. This is where it changes. There is a hospital in Montreal, Canada. It is called the Allen Memorial Institute, and it sits at the top of a hill in a stone Victorian mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal. In the 1950s, its psychiatry department was directed by a man named Ewan Cameron. Cameron was not a CIA operative. He was the president of the American Psychiatric Association, the World Psychiatric Association, and the Canadian Psychiatric Association simultaneously. The CIA funded his work through a foundation called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The funding was confirmed in 1977 by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Cameron believed that mental illness could be erased and a healthier personality installed in its place. He called the process psychic driving. His methods included extended drug-induced sleep, lasting up to 65 days, electroconvulsive therapy, administered at 30 to 40 times the normal intensity, sensory deprivation in a specially constructed isolation chamber he built in the basement of the Allen, and looped audio recordings, a single phrase, repeated up to 500,000 times into the ears of a sedated patient. The patients, in many cases, had come to Allen Memorial seeking help for relatively minor conditions: anxiety, mild depression. Some had checked themselves in voluntarily. The documents confirmed under CIA file MK Ultra Subproject 68 show payments to Cameron totaling approximately $69,000 between 1957 and 1964. Cameron died in 1967. In 1980, the CIA settled lawsuits brought by 9 surviving patients. The settlements totaled $750,000. The individual patients received amounts ranging from $20,000 to $100,000 each. There are survivors still alive. They remember going in. They do not remember what they were like before. That is not a metaphor. That is the mechanism of what was done to them. And Cameron's professional associations, the organizations bearing his name on their honorary rolls, did not remove him from their historical records until decades after the documents were public. You trusted a doctor once. So did they. 2. MK Ultra was not a single program. It was a bureaucratic umbrella covering 150 sub-projects run across 80 American institutions, including 44 universities, 12 hospitals, 3 prisons, and 9 pharmaceutical companies. When CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the files destroyed in 1973, the shredding teams worked for days. The building where the documents were held was stripped to the walls, but Helms's team missed a filing cabinet. In a CIA records facility in Warrenton, Virginia, in 1977, a researcher from the Senate investigation found a box of financial records that had been misfiled as routine budget documents. Those records became the foundation of the congressional investigation. The Senate hearing room where they were presented had cameras. The testimony was broadcast. What the financial records revealed was not just what happened in Montreal. It was the architecture of a program designed to understand and to use the full range of psychological manipulation. Mind control, as the program was colloquially called, is an imprecise term for what was actually studied. The documents show experiments into hypnosis, drug induction of suggestibility, electrostimulation, and the creation of what the researchers called amnesia barriers, psychological compartmentalizations in which a subject would perform an action they could later not recall performing. 8 American universities, whose names are in those files, still have academic buildings standing on their campuses today. Students walk through those buildings on their way to class. Researchers work in them. The buildings are named for donors. The donors are in the records. You cannot unknow what is in those files. You can only decide what to do with knowing it. 1. The last file is the one they shredded hardest, and the one the single surviving cabinet revealed most clearly. It is called Operation Bluebird, and then Operation Artichoke, and then MK Ultra. The names changed. The objective did not. The objective, as stated in the founding memorandum written by CIA officer Morse Allen in April 1950 and recovered in the Warrenton files, was this: can we get a person to do something against their will and against their own survival instinct, and later have no memory of having done it? The program began in a nondescript building in Washington in 1950. It moved to Japan, to Germany, to Korea, wherever American custody of foreign nationals could provide what the researchers called non-voluntary subjects. The first confirmed tests used prisoners held at a detention facility in Japan, where American personnel had uncontested jurisdiction under occupation authority. Subjects were administered compounds developed at the Army's Chemical Research Facility at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a building that still stands behind a chain-link fence off Route 40. The confirmed experiments included inducing confessions using drug combinations, testing whether subjects could be trained to deliver information while appearing asleep, the creation of a conditioned response, a specific trigger phrase or physical cue that would cause a subject to perform a pre-programmed behavior on command. One document, recovered in the Warrenton cabinet and now held at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, describes a test in which a female subject was placed under deep sedation, given a specific instruction, brought out of sedation, and confirmed to have no memory of the instruction. 24 hours later, the trigger was applied. The subject performed the action. The document describes this as a successful proof of concept. It was dated 1954. The program continued for 19 more years. The men who ran these programs were not monsters in the conventional sense. They had offices, they had families, they attended the same universities whose buildings still stand. They wrote their reports in the careful, bloodless language of research science, and their reports are filed, indexed, and publicly available at the National Security Archive in Washington, in a reading room with beige carpet and fluorescent lighting, where you can make an appointment and read them yourself. What they built was not a weapon you can hold. It was the knowledge of what a human being becomes when the right variables are applied in the right sequence. That knowledge was written down, it was distributed, and the shredding teams in 1973 were given a list of which files to find. They missed one cabinet. The question is not whether this happened. The documents prove it happened. The question is what was in the cabinets they did find, the ones that burned completely, the ones where even the ash was swept away. Those answers are not in any reading room. They are not in any archive. They are in the space between what we know and what we were never meant to find out. And that space is not empty. It just hasn't been opened yet. We started today with 13 operations that were sealed, shredded, denied, and eventually confirmed. A tunnel built for an enemy who already knew it was coming. A cat. An artist who never knew his patron. A doctor who believed he was healing. An entire architecture of manipulation, funded, documented, and filed by men in offices who used the language of science for things that science was never designed to do. Here is what sits with you after reading all of it. None of these programs were run by rogue actors or lone extremists. They were budgeted, they were reviewed, they were signed by people with institutional authority. And then they were covered up, not by burning the truth, but by creating so much paperwork around it that the truth became unfindable. The one cabinet they missed. That's the whole story, not the shredding, the miss. So here is your fork. If one more filing cabinet existed, one more box of misfiled budget records, which file would you least want to open? The one about the doctors, or the one about the artists? If this changed the way you look at a painting, or a newspaper, or a hospital, that feeling is the point of every declassified file. Not outrage, recognition. That is what these operations were always really about. The management of what you recognize as real. Stay safe, and see you soon.